Imagine this. It's 1940. Britain stands alone, bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. The empire that once ruled the seas now can't even protect its own skies. Its people queue for food, its cities burn, and its treasury is bleeding dry. The country that once financed half the world's trade has become a beggar at the world's doorstep. And who steps in to help? The United States, a nation that would soon call itself the arsenal of democracy, but one that also saw an opportunity too good to pass up. This is not just a story about wartime aid. It's about how economic desperation can turn allies into creditors, how moral ideals can be priced in gold, and how help can come with invisible strings that last for generations. Today we'll unravel how the United States profited from Britain's desperation in World War II. Through the Lend-Lease Act, secret gold transfers, and decades of debt repayment, it's a tale of survival, strategy, and the cost of friendship when money and war collide. Let's start at the beginning. When war broke out in 1939, Britain was still one of the richest nations on Earth. On paper. It owned vast colonies, controlled global trade routes, and held immense reserves of gold. But this wealth wasn't liquid. Much of it was tied up in far-flung possessions, ships, and industries that couldn't be easily converted into cash. And modern warfare demanded something Britain didn't have enough of: dollars. Why dollars? Because the United States, officially neutral, was the world's workshop. If you needed planes, tanks, fuel, or ammunition, you had to pay in American currency, and Washington insisted on payment up front. Cash and carry, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's policy decreed. Britain could buy weapons, but only if it shipped them itself and paid in cash. By late 1940, Britain's gold reserves were vanishing. Its U.S. assets were being liquidated. The Bank of England quietly shipped tons of gold across the Atlantic to pay for supplies, the largest peacetime transfer of wealth in history. In one secret convoy, more than $2 billion worth of gold crossed the ocean to Canada, and the U.S., guarded by the Royal Navy under the code name Operation Fish. This wasn't charity, it was collateral. Behind closed doors, British officials begged for leniency. The country had become what Winston Churchill privately called broke, but not broken. He knew Britain couldn't fight alone, but asking America for help meant something deeper than financial aid. It meant surrendering economic independence. Roosevelt, meanwhile, faced his own dilemma. The American public wanted no part in another European war, but the president saw that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany could dominate the world economy. Still, he couldn't give aid outright, not without breaking neutrality laws. So Roosevelt proposed something that seemed generous, even visionary: the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. Under Lend-Lease, the U.S. would lend military supplies to nations vital to its defense, with repayment to come later, somehow, someday. It sounded like a gift, but it was structured like a business deal. Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. But this was no garden hose. Britain received more than $30 billion in aid, roughly $400 billion in today's money. And every shipment came with paperwork, terms, and conditions. At first, the British called it a godsend. Churchill himself said it was the most unsordid act in history. But as the war dragged on, a darker reality emerged. The Lend-Lease program wasn't free. The U.S. required that Britain dismantle its system of imperial preference, the trade network that had bound its colonies together. In practice, this meant opening Britain's markets to American goods and ending its control over global trade. The empire that had once built the rules of finance was now playing by someone else's. By the war's end, Britain had not only mortgaged its future, but also lost control of its currency. The pound sterling, once the world's dominant reserve currency, collapsed. The United States emerged not just as the victor of the war, but as the world's banker. And the debt? It didn't vanish with victory. In 1946, Britain negotiated a post-war loan with Washington, $4.3 billion at low interest, but with strings attached. It had to make the pound convertible to dollars, a disastrous move that drained reserves and deepened the economic crisis. The debt from that deal wasn't paid off until 2006, 60 years later. But to understand the true scale of what happened, we have to look beyond the numbers. Britain's desperation didn't just reshape its economy, it shifted global power forever. The gold that crossed the Atlantic became the foundation of America's post-war dominance. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. Washington used Lend-Lease leverage at international conferences to shape new institutions. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bretton Woods system, all designed around the dollar. This wasn't accidental. It was a quiet revolution, financial rather than military. The war had turned the US into the indispensable supplier, creditor, and ultimately, the financial center of the free world. Britain, the empire that once financed others' wars, was now living on borrowed money. And while the official story celebrated Anglo-American friendship, the private reality was colder. In 1941, British officials had to send Roosevelt a detailed list of all remaining gold holdings and overseas assets, an economic confession of weakness. By 1942, American negotiators were discussing the future of the British Empire as if it were already theirs to partition. The breaking point came after the war, when the United States abruptly ended Lend-Lease aid, overnight. On September 2nd in 1945, the very day after Japan's surrender, Washington canceled all shipments. Britain, expecting a transition period, was left stunned. It now had to pay for ongoing supplies in cash it didn't have. The British ambassador called it a cold bath of realism. Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, called it a shock of the first magnitude. To keep its economy afloat, Britain turned again to the US Treasury, this time for a loan under even harsher terms. Keynes, yes, the economist John Maynard Keynes, was sent to Washington to negotiate. He described the mission as the most difficult journey I have ever made. The Americans offered money, but they demanded economic reforms that would permanently tilt global finance toward the dollar. Keynes warned that the agreement would spell the end of Britain as a great power. He was right. From then on, the United States would hold the world's gold, set the world's interest rates, and print the currency everyone else depended on. Britain had won the war, but lost the peace. Yet, what's remarkable is how little of this story is remembered. The Lend-Lease program is often taught as an act of generosity, a symbol of Allied unity. But in economic terms, it was an investment, one that paid extraordinary dividends. The war that bankrupted Europe made America rich. Between 1939 and 1945, US industrial output doubled. Its gold reserves tripled. Its financial power became absolute. The irony? When the roles reversed decades later, when the US became indebted to other nations, it used the same playbook. Loans packaged as aid. Conditionality disguised as cooperation. The same logic that guided Roosevelt's treasury shaped modern institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which often lend to struggling nations under terms that force them to open their markets, privatize industries, and surrender economic control. The pattern repeats. Desperation breeds dependency. Dependency creates leverage, and leverage, in the hands of a creditor, is power. Even today, the echoes of Lend-Lease linger. When the US provides military aid or loans to allies, from Ukraine to Taiwan, the same question lurks beneath the surface. Is it altruism or investment? When a nation in crisis accepts help, does it gain protection or lose autonomy? Consider this. The total debt Britain owed to the US from wartime loans was finally paid off in 2006, 61 years after VE Day. The last payment was around $83 million. Britain marked the moment quietly, with no ceremony. The debt had become a historical footnote, but its consequences still shape the world we live in. So what are the lessons from this story? First, no help comes without cost. Economic aid, even in wartime, is never purely moral. Every dollar loaned is a dollar leveraged. Second, financial systems can be more decisive than weapons. The victory of the United States in World War II wasn't just military, it was monetary. The dollar replaced the pound not through conquest, but through contracts. And third, desperation is the greatest vulnerability of any empire. Britain's fall wasn't caused by invasion or revolution, but by insolvency. Once it could no longer pay its bills, it could no longer dictate the rules. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. Today's alliances, economic crises, and rescue packages may seem different, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Nations lend when it's profitable, not when it's charitable. So the next time a world power offers aid to another, ask yourself, who really benefits? Because in the story of Lend-Lease, the gold transfers, and the long-term debt that followed, one thing becomes clear. Britain may have survived the war, but it did so at the price of its empire, and America's rise was built in part on that debt. The war ended in 1945, but the financial consequences lasted a lifetime. If you found this story revealing, consider subscribing for more history that challenges the myths we take for granted. Because behind every alliance, every victory, and every act of friendship, there's a ledger waiting to be read.